is listening to those dissidents and refuseniks as they speak to him, outline their problems to him. And we hope to use some of our time in this half hour to go live to that meeting, and perhaps you'll be able to hear the president's remarks. Right now, Paula Zahn is with us with the news. Paula joining us now on Good Morning America, and after today will be with us all the time, right?
Happy to be here.
Nice
Thank you,
to have you
Charlie.
here, Paula.
Good afternoon here.
Yes.
Good morning to you, everybody. At a summit that will not produce any major arms agreements, President Reagan is turning his attention to human rights, a sensitive issue with Soviet authorities. We're going to go to a live shot right now at the Spaso House, where Ambassador Matlock is introducing the president. Earlier on, we
after the discussions we've just had,
saw one of the Soviet dissidents address the president and a group of some 100 people through an interpreter. The president has just arrived at the podium. Let's listen to him speak.
Благодарю вас и приветствую вас в дом на Спасо-Песковском переулке. После тех обсуждений, которые мы только что проводили, я решил, что мне следовало бы начать с того, чтобы объяснить вам, почему я так хотел, чтобы настоящая встреча состоялась.
you see, I wanted to convey to you that you have the prayers and support of the American people, indeed of people throughout the world. I wanted to convey this support to you that you might in turn convey it to others, so that all those working for human rights throughout this vast land, from the Urals to Kamchatka, from the Laptev Sea to the Caspian, might be encouraged and take heart.
Видите, я хотел передать вам, что с вами молитва и поддержка американского народа, а в сущности и людей во всем мире. Я хотел вам передать об этой поддержке, чтобы вы в свою очередь это могли передать другим, с тем, чтобы все те, кто трудится на ниве прав человека во всей этой пространной стране, от Урала до Камчатки, от Лаптева моря до Каспийского, почувствовали бы поддержку и окрылились надеждой.
In one capacity, of course, I speak as a head of government. The United States views human rights as fundamental, absolutely fundamental to our relationship with the Soviet Union and all nations. From the outset of our administration, we've stressed that an essential element in improving relations between the United States and the Soviet Union is human rights and Soviet compliance with international covenants on human rights.
В одном аспекте, конечно, моей должности я выступаю в качестве главы правительства. Соединенные Штаты рассматривают права человека как основное, абсолютно основополагающее понятие в наших отношениях с Советским Союзом и со всеми странами. С самого начала существования нашей администрации мы подчеркивали то обстоятельство, что неотъемлемым элементом в улучшении отношений между Соединенными Штатами и Советским Союзом являются права человека и соблюдение Советским Союзом международных заветов по правам человека.
There have been hopeful signs. Indeed, I believe this a hopeful time for your nation. Over the past 3 years, more than 300 political and religious prisoners have been released from labor camps. Fewer dissidents and believers have been put in prisons and mental hospitals. And in recent months, more people have been permitted to emigrate or reunite with their families.
Обнадеживающие признаки есть. И действительно, я считаю, что настоящее время является временем надежд для вашей
What you're listening
страны.
to right now is the president addressing a group of dissidents and Soviet officials at the Spaso House. Of course, we will be following the president throughout the rest of the day. And this is all we have time for the news from Moscow right now. Back to you, Spencer.
Okay, Paul, let's take another look at today's Memorial Day weather. Starting out west with a satellite photo we see.
We pick him up now again.
Often family visits has gone up.
Свобода передвижения. Я говорил генеральному секретарю, как нас обнадежило то, что за последний год увеличилось число лиц, получивших разрешение на
dissidents and refuseniks in Spaso House, which has been the U.S. residence here since 1933. Very hard to explain to people what a charge it is for them.
And yet, the words of the Universal Declaration go beyond these steps. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his own country. It is our hope that soon there will be complete freedom of travel.
И все же слова всеобщей декларации выходят за пределы этих шагов. Говорится, каждый человек имеет право.
The president in the last few minutes has been enumerating the freedoms that he wants to see given to those who are listening to him, freedom of speech, and you heard him just a moment ago referring to freedom of travel.
In particular, I've noted in my talks here the many who have been denied the right to emigrate on the grounds that they held secret knowledge, even though their secret work had ended years before, and their so-called secrets had long since become either public knowledge or obsolete. Such cases must be rationally reviewed.
В частности, в моих переговорах здесь я
This is one of the
указывал
points,
на
Charles, where the Soviets continue to forbid people to travel. Emigration has loosened up somewhat. The right to go and the right to return. But on this question of secrecy, if you've held a job where you might have had access to state secrets, they still use it as an excuse not to let people move.
давно стали общественным достоянием или же устарели. Такие случаи нуждаются в рациональном пересмотре.
And finally, institutional changes to make progress permanent. I've come to Moscow with this human rights agenda because, as I suggested, it is our belief that this is a moment of hope. The new Soviet leaders appear to grasp the connection between certain freedoms and economic growth. The freedom to keep the fruits of one's own labor, for example, is a freedom that the present reforms seem to be enlarging.
И, наконец, об изменении внутри
It is interesting, you talk about the numbers of people allowed to emigrate. There were more than 1,000 Jews allowed to leave the Soviet Union just in the month of April, that right before the summit. Those are not the kinds of numbers that the dissidents want to have leave, and not the numbers that were able to leave, for instance, in the Brezhnev era, but still considerable improvement.
It's the largest number since 1981 in any month, and there are about 11,000 people still with applications pending to leave. And of course, Jewish organizations outside say there are many more people who want to emigrate. And of course, we won't know until this cycle passes if there are many more who make applications. You make application in the Soviet Union, you lose a lot of opportunities on the spot.
We hope that one freedom will lead to another and another, that the Soviet government will understand that it is the individual who is always the source of economic creativity, the inquiring mind that produces a technical breakthrough, the imagination that conceives of new products and markets, and that in order for the individual to create, he must have a sense of just that, his own individuality, his own self-worth. He must sense that others respect him, and yes, that his nation respects him enough to grant him all his human rights.
Мы надеемся.
Charlie, the president's really talking about something essential here. You know, all this talk about glasnost, one thing must be remembered. Glasnost is given from the top. So different from American democracy, which has its root in the earth. And many Russians fear, as we were talking earlier, that many Soviets fear that what's given from the top can be taken away. And he's asking for institutional change in law.
Well, when he talks about institutional change, also, he may have one eye on the party conference that comes next month, and whether or not that Communist Party conference may indeed institutionalize what has just been initiated.
It is considering, among other things, changes in the criminal code, and changes in immigration laws, and changes in the way the party operates.
Должен чувствовать, что он уважаем в своей стране. Причем уважаем
The
настолько.
changes in the criminal code would give defendants greater protection, would give judges, technically speaking, greater independence.
This, as I said, is our hope. Yet whatever the future may bring, the commitment of the United States will nevertheless remain unshakable on human rights, on the fundamental dignity of the human person. There can be no relenting. For now, we must work for more, always more.
Это и есть, как я говорил, то, на что
It
мы
is actually sort of
возлагаем надежду.
disconcerting to hear the applause come about a minute after he is finished saying what he says in English, but of course they don't pick up the inflection of the president's remarks until after the translation is finished.
I must say, this is what we have heard is a pretty soft speech on human rights, very different than we've heard from the president in the past. And it seems consistent with the position he's taken on this subject coming into the summit, that he and Mr. Gorbachev are now going to talk about it calmly.
But as a man, a fellow human being, I came here hoping to do what I could to give you strength. Yet I already know it is you who have strengthened me, you who have given me a message to carry back. While we press for human rights through diplomatic channels, you press with your very lives, day in, day out, year after year, risking your jobs, your homes, your all.
И тут я хочу обратиться к вам не как глава правительства, а как человек.
It is in some respects a lot like the Helsinki speech, in which he started with a recitation of the positive steps that have been taken in the Soviet Union, and then gets to the kinds of changes that he would like to see.
And he speaks of courage, and it takes courage. As these people were going into Spaso today, the KGB was there with its cameras. This question of whether these people will pay in the long run for this is, I think, a less critical one than it was 3 or 4 years ago. But it still takes courage to show up at the American ambassador's residence and be as public about your dissent as people here have been.
If I may, I want to give you one thought from my heart. Coming here, being with you, looking into your faces, I have to believe that the history of this troubled century will indeed be redeemed in the eyes of God and man, and that freedom will truly come to all. For what injustice can withstand your strength, and what can conquer your prayers?
Если разрешите, хочу высказать вам одну мысль от чистого сердца.
Important
Приехать
to remind
сюда,
people at home, I think, Charlie, that these are not all people trying to get out of the Soviet Union. That the number of refuseniks, as we said, is down as best we can tell on paper, but these are people who want greater freedom within the Soviet Union and who've argued, the two people there today, who are editors of very outspoken journals, Lev Timofeyev, who you were mentioning, and Sergei Grigorians, who are publishers of independent journals which are tolerated here at the moment and who are trying to make the system more democratic, trying to create alternatives all the time.
And so I say with Pushkin, it's time, my friend, it's time. The heart begs for peace, the days fly past. It's time, my friend, it's time.
Итак, я повторяю за Пушкиным. Пора, мой друг, пора. Покоя сердце просит. Летят за днями дни. Пора, мой друг, пора.
Could I play a little trick on you and say something that isn't written here?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes when I'm faced with an unbeliever, an atheist, I am tempted to invite him to the greatest gourmet dinner that one could ever serve. And when we finished eating that magnificent dinner, to ask him if he believes there's a cook.
Если разрешите, президент хотел бы добавить, и когда я встречаю неверующего человека, мне очень хочется всегда как-то пригласить его на пир, на банкет, действительно банкет для гурмана. И после окончания этого обеда спросить его, верит ли он в то, что действительно существует повар.
The trick at least didn't throw him.
Thank you all. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Благодарю вас всех.
The president concluding his remarks, as Peter mentioned, to about 100 refuseniks and dissidents who had gathered at Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence. You wanted to tell a quick story about one of these.
Well, I did. I mean, we've talked a bit about the courage of the individual here, and I'm sure that Vladimir Felsman, the Soviet pianist who got out of the Soviet Union quite recently, has subsequently made a great splash in the United States. I went to see him in his apartment here some years ago when he wasn't quite the world pianist star that he is now. And as I was leaving after spending a very happy evening, he said, I want to show you something. And he lifted up his piano, and there, under the strings, was a letter from President Reagan. He figured it was the one place the authorities wouldn't look if they came after him, and he showed me the letter that he'd had from the president. And it was an example of what the spiritual lift that someone, in his case, a Jewish refusenik, got here from the president himself.
And Vladimir Felsman not only left the country, came to the United States, and soon after that played at a dinner at the White House.
That's right. It's the first place he played.
Peter Jennings, thank you again. The president's remarks at Spaso House to the refuseniks and dissidents. We go back to New York and Joan London. Joan?
All right, Charlie and Peter, thank you very much. We want to tell our affiliates down the line that because of the coverage of President Reagan's speech, we are dropping commercial number 14. We are dropping 14, and we are now going to commercial number 15. We'll be back with Sam Waterston and Robert Prosky from A Walk in the Woods in just a moment.
When you open.
Coming up in the 7 minutes before the hour of 9 o'clock, I am back with Peter Jennings and Robert Legvold, who is director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. You were listening to the president. Any surprises in that? The tone, pretty much what he's taken on.
Absolutely. No surprises at all. Indeed, this is a continuation of the diplomacy that he began in Helsinki in his speech. It's an attempt to present a very even-handed approach in which he notes the progress that's been made under the Gorbachev leadership, and at the same time holds the Soviets responsible for continuing to move forward and indeed live up to international obligations. So it is designed to make the point with the Soviet leadership, but also facilitate the summit.
Not to dilute this moment at all, but what happens when you have moments like this sometimes, I think, is we get very carried away and think they've become the centerpiece of this summit. And this is not the centerpiece of this summit, is it, Bob?
Within 12 hours, 24 hours, the attention of the media and newspapers generally are going to be focused on other issues.
Well, but yes, but you raised this question. There is not the kind of momentous movement on arms control that these two men had hoped to have here in Moscow. And as a result, a sort of vacuum is created. And into that vacuum, all of a sudden, comes the human rights issue, which is raised at every summit, but which now becomes to the forefront because of the fact we don't have as much movement in the arms control area.
No one expected major progress in the arms control area. That is, no agreements. And the dialogue on arms control will indeed go forward. There will be things for national leaders and their spokesmen to announce in the course of this summit conference. So I would agree with Peter. I think our attention will begin shifting now. That's not to underestimate the importance of what's happened. It is a dramatic moment when a president of the United States comes to this country and meets with leading dissidents and makes that kind of a statement within the Soviet Union. That's not to be underestimated.
I think that we saw it with the Soviets. They said that they didn't like this meeting that the president was going to have, but it was all prearranged. I think what's happened, you talk about a vacuum, I think these two leaders have accomplished something even more substantial, depending on what school you come from. And that is they've institutionalized summitry now. Mm-hmm. They have made this personal dialogue part of the process in managing Soviet-American affairs. And I think as we look to the next administration in the United States, these are not going to be these great enormous explosions at the summit that we've had in the past.
All right, Peter Jennings, Robert Legvold, thanks for sneaking in here right after the president's remarks. It's now 5 minutes of. We'll be back.
Sunday, Reverend Walker said, Gene, your skin looks really nice.
Headline form, what has gone on here at the summit in day number 2. President Reagan held his second of 4 meetings with General Secretary Gorbachev. He will then tonight be going to the Kremlin where the state dinner given by Mr. Gorbachev for the Reagans will take place. Mr. Reagan also went to the Danilov Monastery where he met with heads of the Russian Orthodox Church, and in just a few moments ago at Spaso House, the U.S. ambassador's residence, met with dissidents and refuseniks here in Moscow. Mrs. Reagan has had more of a sightseeing day. She went to the gravesite of Boris Pasternak, the famous Russian writer, and visited one of the many secondary schools here in this area. We go now for a look at the weather. Spencer Christian in New York. Spencer.
Okay, Charlie, it's going to be a lovely Memorial Day. Over the Rockies, there will be a lot of rainfall under wintry conditions with cold temperatures and even some snow over the higher elevations down through the plains today. Scattered thunderstorms, but it will be a nice day in the east, so go east, go east. And that's a look at the weather. Joan?
And I should explain now that Robert Prosky and Sam Waterston were to be with us today. They're in a wonderful new play called A Walk in the Woods about arms negotiations. However, President Reagan took that time, and so they will be back with us again tomorrow. And we'll see you tomorrow.
This is ABC.
AIDS and heterosexuals. What risks are